The greatest discovery in the history of books, old Bibles and their provenance, A.S.W. Rosenbach. What is the greatest discovery in the history of books? This is the question with which I am constantly bombarded. In letters from all parts of the world, the embryonic bookman, the novice collector, the casual lover of books, the intelligent, the stupid, they make this their leading question. And although I have never been accused of unseemly virtue, I rejoice that the answer is exactly as it should be: the first printed Bible. The momentous recognition of the now famed Gutenberg Bible occurred in the middle of the 18th century. Book collecting was already beginning to discard its somber, conservative guise as an occupation of the religious in monasteries, or as a pastime of the old and very rich. Now this discovery came like a flaming meteor against the literary sky. So many astounding finds have been made in out-of-the-way places, it is somewhat surprising that this first and greatest printed work should have been identified in the very heart of Paris. In a preceding article, I have related the remarkable manner in which several other rare books turned up. There was the copy of Pilgrim's Progress, which made its way from obscurity in the barber shop of a small English town to international fame in a London auction room. And another valuable book, Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, hid unsuspected for years in the lumber room of an English estate before it was brought to light. And a similar copy, equally rare, was used as an archer's target at Shrewsbury before its value was accidentally recognized. What irony, then, that this, the greatest book of all time, the Gutenberg Bible, should have rested in the very center of a literary stronghold, perhaps centuries before its unique preeminence was detected. Thousands of eyes during that time had gazed uncomprehendingly upon this marvel of the printer's art in the celebrated library of Cardinal Mazarin in Paris. How often it was read by strangely undiscerning eyes, eyes of students, eyes of connoisseurs, looked upon by true lovers of the antique. They saw nothing in it but a Bible, one more early Bible. Such men as Descartes, Voiture, and Corneille doubtless turned its pages many times. Certainly it must have been something of a curiosity, even in those days. But what scant imaginations they had! The very idea chills me. It will forever remain a mystery, that Gutenberg Bible in Paris. How did it get there from Germany? Who brought it? How did it happen to be in the Mazarin Library? Did some serious-minded book agent of old France, if there were any then, bargain quietly with the scarlet-robed cardinal, or was the road to its destination one of intrigue, of dishonor, and finally violence? Alas, that we book lovers will never know. A little pilfering here and there was never known to upset Mazarin if the book he coveted was worthy of it. Often I have wondered, when visiting his musty library, what the ancient walls behind the shelves could tell were they suddenly given the power of speech. As the old proverb runs, walls have ears. Nor is it difficult in that majestic palace to watch through half-closed eyes, veiled, of course, by your imagination, the proud old churchman as he pridefully surveys his magnificent books. Perhaps you can see him lingering before the provocative loveliness of gleaming parchment and morocco covers. Observe him as he tenderly removes from its resting place some diabolical work of Machiavelli, or he may pace elegantly between the ancient lecterns and reading posts to bend in silent tribute before the disquieting beauty of some massive old missal. I have easily pictured not only His Eminence, but many assistants as well, searching among the ancient tomes, sandaled monks, learned scholars and librarians, poets and courtiers. They have all passed me in that renowned library, unconscious of my presence, and how the chains still jangle which for centuries have held captive certain small and attractive volumes on shelf and table. Some sophisticated doubters may sigh as they read these lines, thinking, "Poor Rosenbach, what the vineyards of France must have done to him." After I purchased the milk copy of the Gutenberg Bible last year, I learned from the hordes of visitors who came to see it, and through the letters of congratulation and inquiry with which I was flooded, that most people thought this the only copy in existence. As a matter of fact, about 43 copies have been discovered thus far, 10 of which are now in public and private libraries in this country. Perhaps there are others in hiding. There is always that glorious chance. But the very fact that there were these other copies, scattered in various libraries in the old centres of Europe, copies which were there, doubtless, from the time Gutenberg accomplished his stupendous work, makes the more remarkable the first disclosure of this Bible, nearly 3 centuries after its publication. Think of the many wise greybeards who spent their lives searching for knowledge in the vast libraries of Vienna, of Berlin, of Göttingen, of Prague, and at Oxford and Cambridge those centuries ago. Men who saw and read these volumes, and yet did not question their strange peculiarity. For although the Gutenberg Bible gives the effect of a fastidiously written manuscript, it is not only the earliest, but actually the most beautiful work of printing the world has ever known. It was the first work to come from any press using movable types. Whether these were cut from wood or molded in lead can never be conclusively proved. This is immaterial, however, except to the student of typography. The type itself is a large Gothic one, and the ink, now nearly 5 centuries old, is today as black and glossy as the hair of a Japanese beauty. The majestic Gothic lettering was the prevailing one used in Germany for ecclesiastical works at that time, and therefore it was but natural to use it as a model. The pages of the Gutenberg Bible are perfectly spaced in double columns. The great work was published in 2 states. Some copies were printed on paper, others on vellum. The feel of the paper always fascinates me. So firm it is, so beautiful in appearance. It seems alive, yet there is something definitely final about it. It is as though the paper of the Gutenberg Bible had proudly indicated from its inception that nothing finer, nothing more perfect ever could be made. Nor is the vellum of any other old book of finer texture than that which Gutenberg, the master printer, used. The rarest vellum is from the thinnest, the most velvety part of the inner skin of the sheep. This Gutenberg was careful to select, and his Bibles printed on vellum are much more valuable today than those printed on paper. It thrills the lover of books when he observes the superb taste Johann Gutenberg showed in the year 1455. A decade later, printers, his pupils, began to be patronized by princes of church and state. It was they who ordered the most beautiful books, made especially for their private gratification. But there is no record of Gutenberg having any such incentive as wealth or approbation. He must have followed some compelling desire of his own, which led to the creation of the perfect book. It was about 1750 that Guillaume François de Bure, a young Frenchman, proved himself a veritable prodigy among discoverers. At that time, he employed every moment he could spare, working in the Mazarin Library, which, since the death of its founder, had fortunately been in the hands of intelligent and appreciative men. It happened that de Bure one day stumbled upon 2 old volumes he could not recall having seen before. He glanced at them as he passed, and was so taken by their unusual beauty that he resolved to return to study them as soon as possible. Almost the first thing de Bure observed was that there were 42 lines on the page. He had seen, in those magnificent ecclesiastical surroundings, many wonderful Bibles. In a state of hopeful excitement, he looked for and finally located another copy of the glorious book similar to the one in the Mazarin Library, in the Electoral Library in Mainz. This is the copy which is now in the French National Library. De Bure read the inscription in an ancient hand at the end of each volume, several lines stating that the books had been rubricated and bound in the year of our Lord 1456. With these slender facts as a basis, he set about further to establish the authenticity of the greatest bibliographical discovery of all time. There were 2 issues of the Gutenberg, or, as it was originally called, the Mazarin, Bible. The first contains 40, 41, and 42 lines to the column. But this, as a rule, is at the beginning of the book, where it is apparent that Gutenberg was experimenting. He was trying to evolve to his own satisfaction the form of what has since been acclaimed the greatest monument of the printer's art. To obtain the very first issue of the Gutenberg Bible, that is an achievement. Of all books in the world, it is the most important to possess in its elemental state, for it was in this condition that it first saw the light of day. It is true that there is nothing nobler, nothing finer, nothing more beautiful than the Gutenberg Bible in its last completed phase. But to me, the embryonic stage of the first printed book is the most important. Only the first gathering, as we say technically, comprises the first printed book. I believe Gutenberg began printing his Bible a little before 1450 and devoted the first 3 or 4 years to perfecting the movable types. But I doubt if it could have been much earlier than 1455 when he finally completed the first copy. In all probability, he was assisted by his friend Johann Fust, who supplied the money with which Gutenberg bought materials for a press and types. Aided, too, by Fust's son-in-law, Peter Schoeffer, they brought eternal fame to the name of their already famous city, Mainz. Later, many apprentices from Gutenberg's and Fust's atelier went southward to France, Italy, and Spain, where they established the first presses in the great cities of Paris, Rome, Florence, and Seville. These specimens of early printing are known to the specialists as incunabula, or books representing the cradle of printing. The term has been extended so as to include all works printed before 1500. Some authorities have questioned the claim of Gutenberg as the inventor of printing. Coster of Haarlem has been put forth as the real discoverer. There are fragments of early printing with Gothic types that students of typography have dubbed Costeriana. I cannot enter here into a discussion of this controversy. Perhaps both sides are right. At any rate, I have read reams and reams on the subject and have become sadder, if not wiser, at each perusal. Mademoiselle Pélechet, a celebrated bibliophile of the 19th century, studied the question deeply. In the end, as bibliography is a science in which women have distinguished themselves, a woman will probably say the last word. Perhaps the best person to give an opinion on the subject today is Miss Belle de Costa Green, the learned director of the Pierpont Morgan Library. When I visited England 2 or 3 years ago, I was invited to Windsor Castle to see the beautiful library belonging to King George. The librarian, the Honourable John Fortescue, the authority on the history of the English army, showed me many magnificent volumes and manuscripts. Among them was that glorious rarity known to the initiated as the 1457 Psalter, printed on vellum by Fust and Schoeffer. There are in the Royal Library many works of great historical importance, and I listened with delight to his fascinating stories relating to them. Often during the afternoon I stood before the windows of the library to look out upon the vista of green lawns, the winding Thames, and Eton College a few miles in the distance. I thought of Thomas Gray and others who had known so intimately the country about me, of famous men whose names were connected with famous books, and a sudden desire came over me, a desire to see and pay homage to the most beautiful book in the world. By the time I was ready to leave the castle, I had decided to motor over to Eton. When I arrived, I immediately went to the library attendant and asked him to let me see the Gutenberg Bible. This copy in the library of Eton College is, to my mind, the most noble specimen of all. It is in its contemporary binding of old leather, decorated with the original metal clasps and bosses, and it bears the name of the binder, Johann Vogel, who goes down in history as the binder of the first printed book. At the very time of my visit to Eton, the newspapers in England were running editorial comment about several purchases I had just made privately and at auction sales. They complained I was taking away the greatest monuments of literature from their shores. The old attendant at Eton, noting my enthusiasm as I turned the pages of this beautiful Bible, said to me, in a tone tickled with pride, "Wouldn't that Dr. Rosenbach like to carry off this Gutenberg Bible too?" Gutenberg's Bible was set up from the Latin manuscript version, designated by scholars as the Vulgate. Previous to its issue, most manuscript Bibles were written either in Greek or Hebrew. Now, for the first time, it appeared available to all who could read, translated into Latin, the vulgar or common language of the Church. During the past few years, I have purchased 4 copies of the Gutenberg Bible. The first, at the wholesale in 1912, was an edition printed on paper, and with Alfred Quaritch, I later sold it to the late P.A.B. Widener of Philadelphia. It is now in the collection of his son, Mr. Joseph Widener. The second copy, in a superb binding by Fogel, and now in the greatest private collection of Bibles in this country, came from the library of the late James W. Ellsworth of Chicago. It was in a strange manner that I bought this copy. I was halfway across the Atlantic. Before sailing, I had been treating for its purchase, along with the rest of his splendid library. I completed the transaction by wireless. It was thus that the 15th century and the 20th met in mid-ocean. To buy a Gutenberg Bible by radio, it seemed almost sacrilegious. And this recalls another story. I met for the first time aboard one of the great liners a distinguished collector, a man of great taste and judgment. He said to me in the smoking room, 1,500 miles out of New York, "Have you a set of the 4 folios of Shakespeare?" "Yes," I replied, "a fine one, the Trowbridge set. At least I have, if it has not been sold." He asked me to verify it by wireless, which I did, and on receipt of the message he purchased it in mid-Atlantic. No man that ever lived had the prophetic foresight of Shakespeare, yet even he could not have pictured such a thing. And the price? That is still another story. I purchased another Gutenberg Bible, printed on paper, at the Carrisford sale in London 4 years ago, and paid £9,500, a little less than $50,000, for it. Today, it rests, with other great examples of printing and literature, in the library of Mr. Carl H. Pforzheimer in New York City. The Melk copy, which I bought at the Anderson Galleries last year, was as exciting an acquisition as I have ever made. Of course, there were many collectors and dealers besides myself who yearned to own it. The price I paid for it, $106,000, was like the first shot of the Revolution, heard around the world. Mrs. E.S. Harkness bought this copy from me and most graciously bestowed it upon the library of Yale University in memory of Mrs. Stephen Fee Harkness. It is certainly one of the greatest gifts ever made to a university in this country. So many copies have passed into public institutions during the past few years, it is unlikely that many more perfect ones can come into the market. What will its price be in the future? One could as well stem the tides as to block its steady and irresistible march. It is only a matter of time. Today, it sells for more than $100,000. More than $1 million will someday be a reasonable price for it. Although much stress has been laid upon the value and rarity of the Gutenberg 42-line Bible, and it is generally thought to be the most valuable in the world, I believe the 36-line Bible, known as the Pfister or Bamberg Bible, is infinitely rarer. It also was the work of a Mainz printing press, and was probably made under Gutenberg's supervision after he had finished the one which now bears his name. In the old days, it was thought to have been printed before the Gutenberg Bible, but scholars have proved by long study that mistakes are made, which could only have been the result of using Gutenberg's for copy instead of one of the written texts. There are only 14 copies of this 36-line Bible known. 4 are in England, 7 in Germany, 1 is in Belgium, 1 in France, and another in Austria. Yet in all this broad land, there is not one copy. But I rejoice in having a single leaf of it, which I assure you I prize greatly. Probably the most beautiful Bible after the Gutenberg is in 2 volumes, forming what is known as the 1462 Bible. It is the first one that is dated, and was issued at Mainz, printed by Fust and Schoeffer, August 14th, 1462. The copies on vellum seem to be more numerous than those on paper. I bought the last copy, belonging to the Earl of Carrisford, for £4,800. It is not only the first dated Bible, but the earliest example of a book formally divided into 2 volumes. But it is not considered a rare edition of the Bible in any sense of the word, as more than 60 copies are known. In fact, we had two copies of it at one time in our New York vault, both of which were illuminated with grotesque birds and beasts, probably by the same artist. It is odd that, although there are few collections of incunabula in South America, there are two copies of this Bible in the National Library at Rio de Janeiro. Probably the greatest sport of all is the collecting of Bibles in manuscript. It takes a king's ransom today to secure a really fine one. I do not mean the ordinary late 15th century ones, which are quite common, but those executed from the 9th to the 12th century, especially when they are illustrated. Of course, the earliest codices, the very foundation stones of the history of the Bible, such as the Codex Vaticanus in Rome, the Alexandrinus in the British Museum, and the Sinaiticus at Leningrad, are safely beyond the purse of the richest collector. The Pierpont Morgan Library contains the finest collection of illuminated Bibles in America. The vault at 33 East 36th Street, New York, is an achievement almost unequaled in the history of collecting. It is like a view of paradise. The latest acquisition by Mr. J.P. Morgan of some of the Holcomb manuscripts from the library of the Earl of Leicester is a notable triumph in the history of great libraries. Some years ago, I was talking with Mr. Henry E. Huntington in his old library at 2 East 57th Street, New York. I said most humbly, although with proper pride, "How would you like to own the original Conqueror Bible of the architect of the Tower of London?" "There ain't no sich animile," quoted Mr. Huntington. I thereupon produced from a cavernous Gladstone bag two large folio volumes, elegantly bound in blue morocco. "This is it," I said. The Bible was written in the 11th century for Gundulf, 1024 to 1108, Bishop of Rochester, who came over with William the Conqueror and later became the designer of the Tower of London. On the first leaf of each volume, the bishop had written an elaborate curse, excommunicating anyone who should destroy, mutilate, or carry it off. When I showed Mr. Huntington these fatal words, he said to me with a twinkle in his eye, "You old rogue, this applies to you too, you know. I will take the Bible, but without the curse." I recall one day several years ago when I visited the library of the late Sir Thomas Phillips at Thirlstane House, Cheltenham. His grandson, Mr. T. Fitzroy Fenwick, and I were looking over the precious volumes, and we talked of Sir Thomas's ardent love of manuscripts. For more than 50 years he had been the world's greatest gatherer of everything written by the hand of man. His knowledge was equal to his love, and he succeeded in forming an unrivaled library of manuscripts, which included some of the greatest specimens in existence. He did not confine himself to continental examples alone, but was the first great collector of manuscripts relating to America. Sir Thomas Phillips was the patron not only of Lord Kingsborough, whose researches on Mexico are well known, but of George Catlin, who depicted so graphically the life of the American Indian. Mr. Fenwick, who inherited from his grandfather his appreciation and love of fine things, and who possesses an almost unequaled knowledge of old manuscripts, asked me if I had ever seen a manuscript containing Anglo-Saxon writing. I said that I had not, and he thereupon produced the Four Gospels, an English manuscript written in West Anglia in the time of King Alfred, A.D. 850, 900, which contained splendid full-page illustrations of an unusual type. There upon the margins were characters in Anglo-Saxon, written long before the Conqueror came to the shores of Britain. Nothing, however, surprises me at Thirlstane House. One day, Mr. Fenwick showed me the Lisborne Gospels, a superb manuscript made in the 9th century for King Widekind, the only successful opponent of Charlemagne. It was in its old binding of carved wood, and is one of the few very early manuscripts in existence giving the name of the scribe who wrote it. He also showed to me the famous French historiated Bible of the 14th century in two magnificent volumes, which contained almost 100 illustrations, quite in the modern manner, more like William Blake than an artist of old Touraine. I now have these three precious biblical manuscripts, and I doubt whether there is a nobler assemblage in existence. To my mind, the most inspiringly beautiful and important early Hebrew manuscript of the Bible is that in the remarkable collection of Mr. David Sassoon of London. It should be reproduced in facsimile so that all students here and abroad might study not only its unique text, but its glorious illustrations as well. One of the great discoveries in the history of these early Bibles occurred right here at our place in New York 7 years ago. Mr. Sidney C. Cockerell, the great student of manuscripts, called upon me, and I showed him 6 pictures from the Bible and said that they were by a Spanish artist of the 13th century. He looked at them for a moment and said, "No, they're English." I could scarcely believe him, although no one knows more about manuscripts than he. "Let me take them to my hotel and study them. I think they are the work of the earliest known English illuminator, W. de Brailes." He took them with him. If they were English, they would be immensely valuable, worth far more than I, old Captain Kidd, asked for them. You bet I awaited anxiously his return. Finally, he showed up one day and said, "The only trouble with you, Dr. Rosenbach, is that you do not use the eyes God gave you." Lo and behold, he pointed to the halo on one of the saints, and there in neat characters were the magic words, W. de Braille as, Mif e sight. It was one of the greatest attributions ever made by a scholar, and they were, now beyond even the shadow of a doubt, the work of the very artist he had named. According to Mr. Eric G. Miller, there has never been a more triumphant vindication of connoisseurship. These 6 drawings are now in England in the collection of Mr. A. Chester Beatty, who has one of the choicest libraries of Oriental and European manuscripts. Every year when I go to England, I renew, through the kind offices of Mr. Beatty, my acquaintance with the spirit of that doughty old illuminator, W. de Braille. Very few forgers have had the courage to try their hands at duplicating biblical manuscripts. I have always been amazed at the enormous amount of self-confidence a man by the name of Shapira must have had when he offered the British Museum several important-looking manuscript scrolls. They contained the text of the Pentateuch and were, he claimed, from the very hands of Moses. Of course, every expert and noted scholar who happened to be in London at the time went to see these scrolls, which were placed on exhibition at the museum. They were scrutinized carefully, admired as works of curiosity, but no one believed for a moment that they were genuine. Any Semitic scholar knows perfectly well that writing for literary purposes was unknown at the time of Moses. Yet even though Shapira had used an alphabet belonging to a much later period in history, his handiwork was decidedly interesting. Finally, he was informed that his offerings were considered a fraud. He left England bitterly disappointed and went to Belgium. Not long after he arrived there, the continental newspapers announced that Shapira had committed suicide. Even then, when certain of his victims read the lines, they wrote to the papers protesting that the man could not be dead and openly accused him of fabrication, even in connection with his own demise. Such is fame. The most interesting experiments in the history of pictorial art were the attempts to produce picture books for the use of the middle and lower classes of Europe in the 15th century, most of whom could not read. The few specimens of the block books, as they are called, extant today, indicate they were made up of single leaves printed on one side of the paper only. These blocks were all cut by hand from a slab of hardwood, such as that of the pear or apple tree. When the impressions were finally made, the pages were pasted back to back and bound in rough parchment. It is believed by some authorities that the earliest block books date from 1440, although others were undoubtedly printed 15 to 30 years later. The Biblia Pauperum, or the Bible for the Poor, is one of the most interesting examples among the block books. It is composed almost entirely of crude illustrations with doses of text or short explanations and sayings of the prophets above and below the pictures, much in the manner of the tabloids of our own time. No attempt was made to reproduce the whole Bible or even a complete chapter. It was the portions familiarly known to the people which were set down. Thus, the story of St. John, Apocalypsis S. Joannis, was one of the favorite subjects, as was Solomon's Song of Songs. Block books are, of course, among the most desirable and the most difficult to obtain of all the treasures of the bibliophile. Even a single sheet torn from a block book is valuable. I recall vividly when in England many years ago, my first visit to an old library which contained 4 perfect block books, all in magnificent condition. The margins were uncut, and in fact, they appeared to be exactly the same as when they left the hands of the unknown printer in the 15th century. Year after year, I returned to this library especially to see them. Imagine my satisfaction and joy when I was finally rewarded by the owner, who had decided to part with them. There are only 3 great collections of block books in this country. One may be seen at the New York Public Library. Another, also in New York, in the library founded by the late J. Pierpont Morgan, and the third in the Huntington Library in California. The very first type-printed book with illustrations was a Latin edition of the Biblia Pauperum, printed by Albrecht Pfister of Bamberg in 1461. There are only 2 copies known, one in the John Rylands Memorial Library at Manchester, England, the other in the French National Library at Paris. Savonarola, the Billy Sunday of his day, was quick to see the appeal of block books. He had his own sermons printed and illustrated with woodblock printed pictures, which he distributed among his followers. It was he who drew the masses to religion at the time when Florentine art was almost at its peak. He converted Botticelli, caused him to destroy all the sensuous secular pictures he painted previous to his conversion, but happily made up for his loss by inspiring him to paint religious subjects. What would I not give to possess the charred remains of the Bible to which Savonarola clung when he died? There is perhaps a greater lack of knowledge concerning old Bibles than of any other subject pertaining to books. To make matters worse, most people believe they have accumulated many worthwhile facts when all they pick up is some chance misinformation. At least 30% of the 30,000 letters I receive annually are about Bibles or other religious works, which, according to my correspondence, have always been in the family. The largest number of letters come from Germany. But among people of all nationalities, the hoary idea still prevails that age adds value to a Bible. Some people who are not interested in any book, old or otherwise, become excited the moment they find a Bible more than 50 years old. Clasping it to the family bosom, they often rush to my library, either in New York or Philadelphia, buoyed up by an inflated notion of their treasure's value, believing they have sighted a rainbow with a pot of real gold at the end. Almost everyone in the world owns or has owned a Bible. It is the one work which has been translated into every language. It is the world's best seller, and because of this, edition after edition has appeared in every country. No one knows how many millions of pounds the universities of Oxford and Cambridge have received to date in the revenue which has always flowed into their coffers as a perquisite on printed Bibles. The Bible rests beside one's bed today in hotel rooms throughout the country. The Gideon's Bible is the only volume the stealing of which is considered a virtue instead of a crime. The Bible is a book which has touched the hearts of us all at one time or another. When it does not appeal as a religious work, its fascination is felt in the inexhaustible fund of stories and anecdotes which have never been matched by the contents of any secular book ever written. Such tales as those of Joseph and his brethren, David and Goliath, Solomon and the 2 mothers, will never be excelled. A very old Bible is valuable because of its age only if it was printed between the time of the Gutenberg edition, 1455, and the year 1476. Although there were hundreds of editions of the Bible issued in Europe before 1500, only a small portion of them may be considered very valuable today. After 1476, Bibles must show certain characteristics to make them sufficiently desirable to the collector's roving eye. It goes almost without saying that all first editions are worth something. The first Bible printed in Italy, in France, or in Spain, these are all of great value and rarity as well. The first Bible printed in one of the secular languages, in the old days known as the vulgar tongues, for instance, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Icelandic, Swedish, Slavonic, Bohemian, or Basque, these, too, are valuable. Others are the first printed Bible of Strasbourg, issued by Mentelin before 1460. another printed by Eggleston in 1466, the celebrated Our Bible, probably published by Adolphe Roche in 1467 at Strasbourg, the Great Bible, a most beautiful specimen of printing, by Swainheim and Panarts, 1471, and the Great French Bible, made, oddly enough, in Paris 5 years later by three Germans, Gering, Krantz, and Friburger. Hebrew being the original language of the Old Testament scriptures, it is only natural that the first printed in the Hebrew language, Soncino, 1488, should be one of the cornerstones of any collection of Bibles. One of the most glorious productions of the Bible is the Jensen edition, printed in Venice in 1479. I have a superb copy on vellum with a special page of dedication to Pope Sixtus IV. All Bibles with dedications to or from noted persons immediately become significant in the estimation of the book lover. Sometime after the printing of the Vulgate version, certain editors, shrewd enough to discern the public mind, offered a Bible complete with three versions. In the center of the page, they printed the Vulgate, while on one side a Hebrew text was printed, and on the other a Greek. But it is to the first English printer, William Caxton, that the honor should go for the first printed appearance of any part of the Scriptures in English. Caxton came from Kent, and in his youth went to Bruges and Cologne to learn the trade of printer. He was the first to introduce printing into England and the first to print any works in English. He was a scholar of parts, as well as a printer with fine taste, and himself translated into English many of the works which he later published. In 1483 he issued the Golden Legend, which includes lives of Adam, Abraham, Moses, and other characters of the Old and New Testaments. Thus it contains nearly all of the Pentateuchan portions of the Gospels. If this were generally known and appreciated, I feel certain the Golden Legend would approach a price more nearly like that of the Gutenberg Bible. But as the book game is one of magic and alchemy, this may happen unexpectedly any time. Among the 14 or 15 Caxtons in my New York vault, I am happy to say I have a beautiful copy which contains, unmutilated, the account of the murder of Thomas A. Becket, as a friend of mine once wrote it, which has been entirely deleted from most copies. Of course, almost everyone knows that the first complete Bible in the English language was the work of Miles Coverdale. He finished his translation in 1535, and it was printed that same year at Zurich. Although as a work of scholarship it may not rank particularly high, it is translated out of Douche and Latin, according to the title. You will find many of Coverdale's memorable and sonorous phrases preserved in the Authorized version in use today. 10 years previous to the appearance of Miles Coverdale's work, a contemporary of his, William Tyndale, had made a valiant effort to translate and have printed certain portions of the Bible. Perhaps he was inspired by some spiritual force within himself. At any rate, he believed he could best serve his fellow countrymen by translating the New Testament into their language. His ambition grew when one day, in heated dispute with an eminent churchman of England, he was appalled at that worthy's ignorance of the Scriptures. His vow, made then and there, has triumphantly echoed in the ears of all theological students ever since. "If God spare my life," said Tyndale, "ere many years I will cause a boy that driveth his plough to know more of the Scriptures than thou dost." But Tyndale's radical project naturally needed strong financial and political backing. He went to London, where he believed he had a powerful ally in his friend, Bishop Cuthbert Tunstall. In this he soon found he was mistaken, nor could he find any patron with a sympathetic ear and a sympathetic purse as well. This circumstance was not strange, however, because it was just about this time that the powerful Cardinal Wolsey began to lay plans to prevent the invasion of England by the word of God. Discouraged, Tyndale decided there was little hope of accomplishing his work in his own land, and made up his mind to try his luck abroad, even though it meant exile. In Hamburg, Tyndale completed his translation of the New Testament into English from the original Greek. He went on to Cologne, where he hoped to find a printer. It is believed that work on the book was then really started. but that the Senate of Cologne grew suddenly enraged and shocked at the thought of so profane a business going on within its gates. An order was issued to Peter Quentel, the printer, to prohibit its continuance, but before it could be carried out, Tyndale had fled in panic to Worms. He took with him his beloved translation, and perhaps certain pages of the printed work as well. In Worms, Luther was then at the very height of his popularity. This must have been a relief to Tyndale, to find himself in a place where he would have to undergo no further religious persecution. And so the New Testament was printed for the first time in English in a little German city. Tyndale's followers doubtless smuggled it into the home country because almost immediately this New Testament began to appear in England. It filled the clergy with fury, and Bishop Tunstall, Tyndale's former friend, even went so far as to have it burned publicly at St. Paul's Cross in London. It was destroyed in other places as well, before gatherings of ignorant, superstitious, and infuriated people. Indeed, the public burning by the churchmen of Tyndale's New Testament became a popular, if serious, pastime, and the destruction of Tyndale's precious books was a prophetic prelude to his own martyrdom at the stake a few years later. All the earliest English Bibles are extraordinarily rare and worth almost any amount. It is strange to speak of money in connection with the greatest spiritual work of all time, but as Bibles are the cornerstones of any outstanding collection, it follows that they must be bought at a price. Only a fragment exists of the first edition of Tyndale's translation of the New Testament from the press of Peter Quentel in Cologne in 1525. The second edition, printed also on the continent by Peter Schuffer at Worms, probably late in 1525, is almost equally rare, as only 2 imperfect copies survive. I would cheerfully give more than $50,000 for a copy of the first appearance in print of this portion of the English Scriptures. Perhaps some book scout will eventually unearth another. Of the Tyndale Pentateuch, probably printed at Marlborough by Hans Luft in 1530, only 3 perfect copies have resisted the sharp usages of time. The finest of these is in the Pierpont Morgan Library. As to the first complete Bible in the English language, translated by Coverdale and printed in 1535, not a single absolutely perfect copy exists. There are 2 or 3 almost perfect examples in England, none so good in America. There are, however, copies of this book, more or less defective, in libraries in this country, such as in the collections of Pierpont Morgan and Henry E. Huntington, the New York Public Library, the Free Library of Philadelphia, Carl H. Pforzheimer, and A. Edward Newton. This great volume is not of excessive rarity, but of excessive importance. I would risk my chances in this world and the next to obtain a perfect copy. Of the so-called Great Bible, 7 editions were issued within 2 years, 1539 to 41. They are all valuable, but not nearly so much so as the earlier English Bibles. Splendid examples of printing, they are much in demand by collectors, especially when perfect. One of the great monuments of our civilization, the first edition of the Authorized version, printed in London by Robert Barker in 1611, is in every respect one of the finest things a collector can ever hope to acquire. The influence of this book upon the world has been simply enormous. There were 2 editions in 1611, known as the He and She Bible, the He, quite naturally, being the earlier and more in demand. No stones, fair ladies. The distinction comes from a variant reading in the Book of Ruth, the 3rd, 15. In the first version it reads, "He went into the city." In the second, the later printing, "She went into the city." This change of a single letter makes all the difference in the world to the collector, and he has to pay for it. The first issue is worth several thousands more than the second. This is a rare and momentous thing, a perfect. He bringing more than a perfect she. It can only occur in the case of the Bible. I am quite sure that in this even clergymen will agree with me. The price of the first edition of the Authorized, or King James Bible, has not been large in the past. The Huth copy sold at auction in 1911 for only £164, or about $820. But the future, I feel sure, will tell another story. Indeed, I think the time when the collector will give $8,000 or $10,000 for a really fine copy is hovering dangerously near. It is truly a volume so dear and precious to everyone that it must soon take its place among the stars. I remember one day when I was visiting the late J.P. Morgan many years ago. We sat and talked in his office in the old building at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, which in those ancient days bore the sign Drexel, Morgan and Company. Of course, we vied with each other in a genial way, relating stories of our quests in discovering rare books, of purchases we had made at what we considered the proper prices then, and in general confiding to each other those tales of adventure so dear to the heart of the bookman. We talked about old Bibles, especially those which had belonged to celebrated people. Of these, Mr. Morgan already had a remarkable collection. His nephew, Mr. Junius Spencer Morgan, had from the first been a great help to his uncle, with his genuine flair for really fine books and works of art generally, and his uncle often took his advice. The elder Mr. Morgan was a man of great imagination, who enjoyed book collecting as much as anyone I have ever known. Suddenly, during our conversation, his face clouded, and he turned to me and said in a regretful tone, "Doctor, there is one Bible I have missed. The last time I was in London, Quaritch told me about it. He sold it, he said, on his first trip to this country in 1890. It is the great He issue of 1611, and is enriched with the annotations of the translators of the King James Version. The explanations of the holy text were probably made for the use of Prince Henry. What would I give to have it?" Now I knew of this Bible, but hadn't the faintest idea at the moment where it was or who owned it. It had been extended to 5 volumes and bore on the binding the feathers of the young Prince of Wales. But when I secured the library of Clarence S. Bement, 1 year later, there it was. What luck! Mr. Morgan, it is unnecessary to state, bought it immediately. Among the hundreds of Bibles offered to me each year, there is one type which blooms eternal. It is the bullet-hole Bible, the Bible which saved Grandpa's life in the Civil War, or the Revolution, as you will. For a time I was shown such a succession of these that my very dreams were haunted by them. Many a night my rest would be broken when whole armies charged me, each soldier wearing a protecting copy of the Holy Scriptures over his heart. Some people have fondly believed that a tale of sentiment plus a dash of bravery mixed with their own simulated reverence would bring value to the family Bible. The bullet-hole Bible has become such an old story that every time I hear a shot, I think it is someone aiming at the old family scriptures in the backyard. But this is nothing to the Genevan or Breeches Bible, the commonest of all. It is so named because of the 7th verse in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Then the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed phytra leaves together and made themselves breeches. The first edition was printed at Geneva in 1560, and copies in good condition are scarce and valuable. In fact, they are really worth more than the price they sell for today. It was for years the household Bible of the English race. Although translated by the English exiles at Geneva during Queen Mary's reign, it was dedicated to the most virtuous and noble Queen Elizabeth, Queen of England, France, and Ireland. At least 200 editions of the Bible and New Testament were issued before 1630. Consequently, for centuries it was in almost every home. The later editions of this Bible have therefore become the bête noire of every bookseller. They turn up everywhere, their proud possessors asking fortunes for copies hardly worth the value of old paper. The copies published after 1600 are the worst offenders. It is a pity for the peace of mind of the booksellers that they were not all destroyed in the Great Fire of London. They still exist to torment the souls of bookmen, and although the language of the Genevan Bible has always been considered good, homely English, the language of the bibliophile, when he receives one on approval with charges collect, is certainly more vigorous and expressive. Not long ago, a woman came to my Philadelphia library with a Breeches Bible. True, it was rather ancient, authentically dated 1629. From the moment I met her, I realized she suffered from suppressed emotions of some sort. Although I am accustomed to prospective sellers with queer symptoms, I was rather alarmed. Her hands shook violently. She was deadly white one moment and a flaming pink the next. When I inquired what she wanted for her Bible, she replied in quick, nervous tones, $50,000. Now I am always amazed at these grand ideas of value evinced by the layman. I hope I do not always show my surprise. Indeed, some people accuse me of having a poker face. This Bible was certainly worth no more than $20. But before I apprised her of the distressing news, which I always hate to impart, I was cautious enough to call in one of my assistants to aid me should she collapse on my hands. It is to the eternal credit of bookmen that the sense of humor has been the ruling passion with them all. They all see the joyous, the fantastic, the capricious side. They are never serious, never unduly bowed down with the gravity of their calling. Although they are ardent, nay, passionate lovers, they always remain gay and debonair. The history of old Bibles bears eloquent witness on this point. Why do bug Bibles, vinegar Bibles, wicked Bibles tickle the fantasy of collectors? For instance, Matthew's Bible of 1551 contains the reading in Psalm XI, 5, so that thou shalt not need to be afraid for any buggies by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. Or think how the Christian world would have been disrupted if it had followed the commandments of the 1631 Bible, which leaves out entirely the not in the seventh. This terrible, wicked book reads, Thou shalt commit adultery. Only 4 copies escaped the public executioner, and the poor printer was fined £300 by Archbishop Laud. Baskett's Oxford Bible of 1717 is a mine of magnificent errors, the most amusing being that of the parable of the vinegar instead of vineyard. There are 3 tremendously important American Bibles: the Eliot Indian Bible, the Sauer, and the Aitken Bible. John Eliot, apostle to the Indians, translated the Bible into their language and had it printed in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1661 to 63. Thus, the first Bible issued on this continent was, appropriately, in the tongue of its natives, and the second was in German, the first in a European language printed in America, from the press of Christopher Sauer at Germantown, Pennsylvania, in 1743. The third, at last in English, was printed in 1782 by R. Aitken at Pope's Head, 3 doors above the coffee house, in Market Street, Philadelphia. The great demand for early Americana will surely raise these 3 treasures to heights at present undreamed of in the bookman's philosophy.